This morning's text is one verse, but it's a powerful and important verse, so I invite you now to hear what God has to say to us this morning in Deuteronomy 7, verse 6. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the earth to be his people, his treasured possessions. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In 1993, David Icey, a journalist, decided that he would give a tape recorder to two young boys in the ghetto of Chicago, on the east side of Chicago, and allow them to tell their story. Now, the first time I heard about this, I thought, why in the world would a professional journalist give a tape recorder to two very unprofessional young boys in the ghetto to tell their story? I mean, after all, by 1993, there had been a plethora of news reports on life in the ghetto, both by journalists who had interviewed people who lived there and by so-called experts on poverty who told us what it was like for people to live in the ghetto or what ghetto life was like. And so as I prepared to listen to this interview, I thought to myself, why would he have chosen those two boys? And really, what's the point? And then I listened to the interview, and I came to understand that those boys had an awful lot to teach people like me. You see, the choice of those boys telling their own story is that they actually lived in the ghetto. They weren't just experts in ghetto life. They were part of the ghetto. And for those of us who had never lived in a ghetto or really even visited long enough to say that we had built relationships with people who lived in that kind of poverty, those boys had an awful lot to teach people like me. Some years later, in 1998, David Icey went on to interview people that lived in the last flop houses in the Bowery of New York City. Now, if you don't know what a flop house is, back in the 1930s and during the Depression in New York City, many of these flop houses started to be built, and they were really for people that could no longer afford to live anyplace else. They were one of the worst places that anybody could live, but it was shelter nonetheless. There were still flop houses in the Bowery in the late 90s, and so David Icey decided he would go and talk to the people that lived there. These were 4 by 6. I want you to picture 4 foot by 6 foot cells with a bed and a locker. And these men lived there for decades. There was chicken wire on the walls to support the walls, so in case you knocked into it, you didn't end up in your neighbor's room. Over the time, David decided that it would be good to write a book about this, and he did, in fact, do that. And the book is called Flop House. You can get it online even today. But he brought an early copy of the book with him. He used the photographer David Wang, actually helped him with pictures. And so he took an early copy of the book into one of the flop houses, and he showed one of the men his picture and the interview, the story that was in there about him. And the man looked at the book for a minute quietly at his picture and the words that were written about him. And as he grabbed the book out of David's hand, he ran down the narrow hall with the book over his head and the page open, yelling, "I exist! I exist!" I think that perhaps for the first time, this man had been chosen to tell his own story. Nobody talking at him, nobody talking for him. He had his own voice, and he told his own story. And he finally existed. Isn't that the power of being chosen? Isn't the power of being chosen the ability to acknowledge that you have your own humanity? that nobody needs to speak for you because you can speak for yourself. Chosen. David Icey really understood the power of this, and so sometime later, he actually put together a company called StoryCorps. And StoryCorps allows people to tell their own stories, but in a private and intimate and quiet way, where one person chooses another person to record their story. You get to make the choice, you get to ask the questions, but you don't get to talk. You get to listen. And the story is recorded, and then it's archived so that your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren can pull that archive and hear the story of your life. Your humanity is honored. This isn't just a soundbite of human existence. This is the core of human existence that says, you matter. You're important. You're chosen. Who would you choose? Whose story would you choose to listen to? Would it be the person that you're most comfortable with, that lives in your home, who you probably should know pretty intimately by now? Or would it be somebody else? You know, in a day and age where everybody is screaming that their life matters, maybe what we need to do is stop screaming at one another about our lives mattering, if that's even a word. And maybe what we need to do is actually sit respectfully and listen to the other person. Because let's face it, nobody listens and nobody hears when everybody is yelling at one another. And I do believe that if we actually listened to one another, if we started to treat people like they mattered, that maybe we would learn that we actually are all created in the image and likeness of God, and that we all have equal value and equal worth. Not because of a group that we belong to, not because of what our zip code is, not because of what color our skin is, but because we have a common story, a human story about what it means to be chosen. I think what we all tend to forget is that the thing that those boys in the ghetto and those men in the flop house and so many other people share is that people stopped remembering or stopped believing that they were human, that they had any value outside of what the power structures and economic systems could use them for. And perhaps it's not about what the power structures take from us or what we owe to an economic system. Perhaps what's really important is we have to remember as a people that God gives us value without ever being part of the human created systems. Now, yes, we are human, but our power and our worth doesn't come from a system created by human beings. Our power and our worth comes from our chosenness by God. There's real power in being chosen, and it can be very frightening for some people. Dr. Fred Craddock, who recently passed away, was a great preacher and storyteller. He taught preaching at the Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, and he told a story many years ago about a church in Kansas City that was in decline. The church was in decline, and it was also in a declining neighborhood. It was an inner city church in Kansas City. But the church, even though it was in decline, continued to have after-school programs and summer camps for the inner city children. And so during a summer program, there were lots of children, and they would have food and games and songs and Bible stories. Every day, these children would gather together to be in community in that church. And a mother came one day looking specifically for the pastor. And so he came out, and he was a young guy, and he was talking to this mother, and the mother said to him, I'm thankful that you're feeding my child and playing with him and singing with him. She said, but the stories have to stop. And the pastor said, we're not trying to indoctrinate your child. We don't want him to change his religious affiliation. We're just telling Bible stories. That's all we're doing. And she said, the stories have to stop. You see, my son is starting to believe that he's as good as everyone else in Kansas City. He's as good as everyone else in Kansas City. And you are setting him up for bitter disappointment. What she was really saying to that pastor was, people don't choose boys like mine. People don't choose men from this part of Kansas City. Stop telling him that he's that good, that he's chosen. Because in her world, her son was not chosen. Church, we have so much work to do. But the power of being chosen is the power of life. It's the power where everybody recognizes that everybody is on the same playing field. And that child's chosenness didn't come from the social structure he was in, but it came from God, and he heard that loud and clear, and this mother was scared to death. For many of us in this room, we have no way of acknowledging what that mother or any of those people probably felt like. Because let's face it, in this room, me included, most of us have been chosen for most things. We've been chosen for the job of our choice. We've been chosen for the school of our choice. We were chosen for the team. We were chosen for the group. We were chosen for the club. We live a life where we're used to actually being chosen for things. And so to try to get our brain around the idea that some people are not chosen is really difficult for us. But the truth is if we start to peel back some of the layers in our own hearts and minds, we might recognize that what we fear the most is that we might not be chosen. We might be rejected, excluded, left out, felt as if we were not important enough. We choose where we work, we choose where we go to school, we even choose who we marry. We make lots of choices. And God has given us resources to make those choices with. And that's not bad and it's not wrong. We can make those kinds of choices. When it starts to get a little fuzzy, though, is when we say who we're going to choose to love and who we're not going to choose to love. Because that choice isn't ours to make. The choice to love all people does not belong to us because God's already made that choice for us. God says that all people are worthy of love. God says no one is excluded, no one is rejected, all lives matter. God has taken that choice away from us. And somehow we have decided that, maybe we're just a little better than some other people, so we get to make the choice. And the answer to that is no. We don't get that choice. We don't get to choose who matters. We don't get to choose who's in. All people are chosen by God for salvation. All means all. In 2010, when my dad was dying, we had some of those more poignant conversations. And I encourage you that while your loved ones are still alive, to have poignant, important conversations with them about things that most people save until they're at death's door. So one of those conversations went like this. One day I was sitting on the bed, and he had a paper in his hand, and he was reading his prayers that day. And he said to me, "Do you think God hears these prayers?" And he was holding his piece of paper in his hand. And I said, "Dad, Come on. God hears the prayer on your paper, and he hears the spontaneous prayer that I will pray with you in a little while, but he also hears those things that we wish he didn't hear sometimes. And we laughed. We talked about that, and that God is going to hear his prayers, and he didn't have to worry about whether it was written or not. But then the conversation got really serious, and he said to me, "Will I ever see you again?" And that was a tough question, because I knew what that meant. You see, we grew up in a denomination where only certain people were in. Only certain people got to heaven. And I had not only left that denomination, but I had the audacity to become a pastor in another denomination. And he was worried. He was worried about that. The burning question for him is, are you going to be in heaven? Are you still chosen? You see, because he knew that there were people that would tell him that I was no longer chosen, that I was out. And I had the very huge privilege of saying to him, "You know what, Dad? I think that God's mercy, God's goodness, God's grace extends even to people like me." I said, and if I'm going to fall on the mercy of God, I'm going to tell you, and I believe it, and I believe what I told my dad was true that afternoon. I'll see you again. I'll see you again. In a little while, we are going to be invited to the table. The invitation is going to be made that anyone who is wanting or looking for a new life in Jesus Christ is welcome. All people are welcome at Christ's table, and Christ is the host. He gives the bread, he gives the wine. It's an invitation that's open, not closed, because every life matters. We didn't write Christ into our story. Christ already wrote us into the story of salvation, the story of faith. He chose us. We didn't choose Christ. God chose before we even had the capacity to sit in these seats. There will be invitations that you will not receive in this lifetime, that I have not received in my lifetime. This invitation is for all people. There are job offers that we will never receive, but the work of the disciple is open to everyone. There are tables we will never be invited to sit at. Christ chooses you and me to come to the banquet table. So who would you choose? Who would you choose to eat this meal with? Who would you choose to turn away from the table? God says the choice is not yours to make. Isn't that great news for all of us here? The choice is not ours to make. God's already chosen, and God has chosen all. Come to the table. Amen.